Thanks for the introduction. Is my mic on? Can you hear me? Yes. Good, okay. Well, first of all, I'm gratified that you all showed up to listen to me, and I hope that I can tell you something that at least is interesting, maybe a little funny, and I am going to talk about things that aren't always positive. But we learn from things that aren't positive, and we hopefully take the things we learn and do positive things with them. So I want to see who's who in the audience. How many entrepreneurs do we have in the audience? Raise your hand, please. Okay. How many investors do we have in the audience? Okay. Could use more investors in the audience with all these entrepreneurs. How many people that provide services or products to entrepreneurs do we have in the audience? A lot of service people. Okay. How many academicians do we have in the audience? How many professors or teachers? Just a couple. How many students? All right. Pretty much a mix across the board. Okay. So I'm going to tonight go over 3 confessions of mine that I haven't really confessed to anybody. Now, 2 of the guys that I work with are here tonight, and I don't think they've heard my confessions, so it'll be news to them. And 4 lessons that I learned over the years. I have one more question. I'm working in a self-driving car insurance startup, and Ed Coombs over here is in charge of insurance, and he wants to know how many Tesla owners we have in the audience. Anybody own a Tesla? Because Ed will pay you money to do an experiment with your Tesla, just so you can see him afterwards. Lots of money. Ed is loaded. He just has cash, probably about 100,000 cash on him at the moment. So maybe he'll fund, if you guys need seed money, he might be able to do that. So let's talk. I've founded 16 startups. I know it's an insane number. And Steve Jobs once told me, like, why do you do all these? You just got to pick one thing and just do it. And I said, well, whatever isn't successful. He said, you do it long enough, it'll be successful. Well, I don't know if that's true, but there are various reasons why I did the next one. Sometimes I did the next one because the other one failed. And sometimes I did the next one because the other one sold. And, you know, there's lots of reasons. But I'm really addicted to risk and doing startups. I have 7 kids. They're not all through school. I made a lot of money. I spent a lot of money. I've been broke. I've had money. It just doesn't matter what. I love the risk. I love the idea of creating something from nothing, whether it's a service or a product or changing the world. And I think you really can change the world. And you can also create money from nothing, which is also a good thing in many cases. So these are the startups that I created, or was it CEO of, or was a co-founder of, or was involved at the creation. And the first confession is that I've failed way more than I've succeeded. I've succeeded on 6 of these. And by success, I mean the investors got their money back. Because in venture-backed startups, that's what you do in addition to following your passion, in addition to trying to change the world, you got to make those people who gave you money. And that's why they're there. They can, and they can be passionate about it, but they're investing money to make money, right? So all these companies made investors money. And all these companies didn't make investors money. They lost money. They lost some of my money and sometimes their VC's money, and they all failed. And so 10 failures is a lot, so I don't have time to tell you about all 10 of them. So I picked 3 failures to talk about tonight, because I think they're illustrative of the things that I think you all face when you're starting companies. And so a little background on me. I grew up on an island in Maine. My dad was a barber. We didn't have a lot of money, but we didn't want for anything. I escaped Maine and went to MIT, fortunately, and that was a good thing. I got to meet lots of people that I would never have met before, and I still keep in touch with them. And out of MIT, I took my first job. My first job I interviewed with tons of people, and I took the job that paid me the most money. And that was not the right, I was miserable. I was working at Honeywell in a cube with 3 or 4 other people and just coding all day long, some stupid thing, I don't even know what it was. It was a router, some circuit board router programming thing. And I lasted 3 months there. And even though I wanted to get out of Maine, I ended up back in Maine at this biomedical research laboratory that was on the island that I grew up on, running the data center. And I thought, well, okay, I wanted to get out of Maine and I wanted to be in the mainstream, but I guess I couldn't, cut it in the mainstream. So I went back there. And I was there for about 5 years, and I built a whole big data center for them. And I was sort of discovered by the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda. And they said, Randy, why don't you come out here? You can be an expert consultant for us, and you can go around to all of our grantees and figure out if they're using computers correctly. So while that was fun, I was traveling all the time. I wasn't married. And it was interesting because when you walk in and you're from the National Cancer Institute and they're the ones giving you money, you kind of get the red carpet treatment. So that was fun for a while. But then I looked at what was going on in Washington, D.C. area, and it was always the Beltway bandits that were doing the cool things or making the money. And so I took a job with Booz Allen and Hamilton in Bethesda in the Management and Information Systems division. And that was interesting because I got to see a lot. They were basically looking at all the startups that were doing tech. And so I saw all these startups, and I thought, well, I kind of like, this is where I started to get the bug of doing a startup. And there was this one startup, this is my first fail. And the startup's name was the International Institute of Applied Technology. Now that name alone should have clued me. This is a little bogus, but it was a public company. It was taken public in the penny stock market. And they raised like $2 or $3 million, and they said, come be our VP and general manager. And they were doing some interesting things, I thought. They were creating, authoring interactive video discs and controlling them with Apple II computers and touch screens and doing training courses for the government. So they basically go out and get a government contract, and they create these training courses. And they would program them, and they would then, get the revenue that way. And so it's sort of on the bleeding edge at the time. And so I joined, but I didn't do my due diligence. I didn't realize that they were almost out of money. I didn't realize that the CTO was basically taking all of the money and putting it in his consulting company. And I didn't realize that the CEO had a drinking problem. So at one of the first board meetings I was at, and this is a totally true story, the CEO didn't show up. This was in Washington, and the board's like, where is he? And it turned out that he had gotten drunk, gone to LaGuardia, out of New York City. He was in New York. He went to LaGuardia, and he punched a police officer. And they arrested him, and then this was the day before, but he was back in his hotel, passed out at the time of the board meeting. So the board said, well, Randy, why don't you be CEO? Okay, and your first job is to fire the ex-CEO when he sobers up and comes back. And this guy's like 6'3". And I did fire him. He did lift me up against the wall while I was firing him. And then he stormed out. And I didn't see him again for a while. And we had a bunch of contracts we were bidding on, and one of them was a big postal service contract, and the RFP was written by my friends at Booz Allen and Hamilton. And I said, hey, you guys should write in some sort of training thing into the RFP. And I think about it later. It's kind of wiring in a contract. Not necessarily a good thing to do, but done all the time in Washington, believe me. And we were able to build a backlog of $100 million in sales for this company. And I thought, like, wow, this is great. The company's doing great. But it's a public company. And public companies every year, usually, have annual meetings. And in the annual meeting, they elect a new board of directors. And the majority of shareholders vote on this board. And so, lo and behold, the CEO assembled his friends, and it just so happened they had the majority of shares owned in the company, and they voted in their own board. And when their board met for the first time, they fired me. So I didn't take it really well, because I thought, gosh, if you do a good job and you build a company up and you make money for the company, why are you getting fired? This doesn't make sense to me in my naive view of the world. I didn't realize that, greed has this effect on people, right? It's when you don't have any money, then people generally don't take advantage of you very much, right? And when you have a lot of money, the company has a lot of money, people take advantage of it because they want that money, and the best way to get money, and the easiest way to get money is to take it from someone else. So I retired to the woods. That's me. I just checked out. I went back to Maine again, and I cleared land. I cut down trees, and I lived off my credit cards. And I didn't have any money, and it didn't turn out well because I was broke, and my car got repoed. And you know how this story goes, right? It's my next confession. I declare bankruptcy. I owed $10,000, which to me at the time seemed like an infinite amount of money. I couldn't possibly pay it. So I went in, the lawyer's like, yeah, give us $700. You declare bankruptcy. You don't have any debts anymore because you have this bankruptcy thing in your credit rating. But that's good because you don't run up any credit anymore because you can't get credit cards. This is lesson number one. Never lose control. If you start a company and you're in that company, even if you're working at a company, look at the cap table. The cap table shows you the capitalization of the company and who owns what shares, and figure out who really is in control. Now, in Facebook, even though Zuckerberg doesn't own the majority of shares, he has majority voting because his shares, for every one of his shares, he gets 10 votes. So even though he doesn't own the shares, when it comes to decisions being made in the company, he controls it. And when you start companies these days, if you think the company's going to be big, lots of companies start with founders' voting stock being multiples on the voting. Something to think about. Something to think about. Because when you lose control, it doesn't matter how good a job you did, especially if there's money to be had. You see these companies getting ready to go public, or these companies that have gotten funded, or these companies that are taking off, and then one of the founders is gone. That's what's happening. So lesson number one, keep track of who has control. The good news for me was, and coming out of this and learning that lesson, was that around that time the Macintosh was invented. And I'm stuck in Maine hearing about the Macintosh, and I'm thinking, holy cow, this is innovative, this is disruptive, this is a totally different way to do computing. And it was. The user experience was completely different. So I thought, and I looked at what else was out there, and IBM PCs running DOS. Like garbage, really awful. And I thought, well, I could probably program DOS to look like a Macintosh. Stupidly, and I did. I just sat and worked night after night after night after night after night. And I wrote this app that used Macintosh fonts. I even licensed them from Apple. They didn't expect that I'd be using fonts on a PC. There was no restriction on the license. They thought I was licensing the fonts for a Mac on my Mac program. But I was really licensing for the PC. And I wrote this app, and it took me like a year. And I was broke. And it became PFS First Publisher, which was really the first desktop publishing product for the PC. And it used Mac fonts. And I brought it out to California to meet with a company named T-Maker, run by a lady named Heidi Roizen, who now works for Draper Fisher Jorgensen, or I guess it's Draper Fisher now, or just Fisher, who knows. But anyway, Heidi published it, and I moved out to Silicon Valley, and just never went back, because they wrote me a check for $1 million. And I thought, like, this is so weird. I just went bankrupt. I had my car repoed, and I went bankrupt for $10,000, and now someone wrote me a check for just insane. And I thought, like, okay, that cemented it. I'm going to be an entrepreneur from now on. I'm going to keep doing it. How many times can I repeat this? This is a great deal. But I remembered I needed to be frugal, so my purchases were not exactly frugal. So I'm cruising around Silicon Valley in my new Ferrari. And that's my brother. He's the only one that would ride with me because everybody else was working at the time. And what I discovered, like, if you're if you're relatively young in your early 30s or late 20s, and like, there's nobody to play with. Like, all your friends are working and they're doing something. I mean, I guess there are people who are idle rich, but I didn't have friends in that space. and so I got kind of bored. And one of my buddies was working at Next. Steve Jobs had just gotten fired from Apple. And he had a small company, there's like 8 or 10 people in the company. And my friend Bill Parkhurst went to work there. And he said, Randy, you gotta come by, we're doing really cool stuff. So I went by and I interviewed. And I interviewed with Steve. And he asked me, I remember he said, Randy, what gets you going? What gets you up in the morning? And I'm like thinking because I'd read all about Steve because I'd researched the Macintosh and something like, what can I say to Steve to kind of like push his buttons the right way? So I said, Steve, sometimes I have a really hard programming problem and I can't figure it out. And it takes days and I still haven't figured it out. And I just go to sleep at night and I wake up at 4 in the morning and I have the solution and that's what I live for. And he said, Randy, welcome to Next. But I didn't join. I turned down the offer because the salary they were paying me, it's money again, that stupid money decision, the salary they were paying me wouldn't cover the taxes that I was on my royalty payments for the personal publisher thing, for the first publisher thing. So I said, no, I'm not going to do it. And this is the first time Steve called to me and he said, Randy, you're really blowing it. You really need to work at Next. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. And he left it on my answering machine. I think he still probably had the recording somewhere, just kind of kept it. And so I went to work for Next. So this is a picture of me at Next in those days. I cleaned up my act a lot from being in the woods, I got a haircut. This is Susan Kerr. Susan did all the fonts for the original Macintosh. She also was hired by Microsoft to do all of the stuff for the Windows 3.1, which is the version of Windows that really broke them out and actually made Windows successful. Very, very talented person. Lives in Southern California now, kind of retired, I think. The thing about the Next machine was this big black cube, and you guys have probably seen it. But in here, these are optical discs, and Steve loved it because it was like state of the art. And this is where stuff was stored, right? But this processor ran a version of Linux. Now, Linux is like Unix, like there's a whole bunch of variants of it now. And the problem with Linux is that you can just keep running things on it over and over and over and over. And when its memory gets full, it swaps it out to disk. And so it's constantly swapping things, moving programs out of memory and onto disk and back and forth. Well, these disks were the only disks that were on the machine. There's no hard disk. Steve, no. Evil, no hard disk. Like no power switch, that kind of thing was weird. And these things are notoriously slow. So I'm in an engineering meeting with the engineers. There's only like 7 of us. Steve's there. And I'm like, this thing is going to thrash itself to death. This is going to be the slowest machine you've ever made, Steve. This thing is going to not work. And so Steve pulled the room. He said, who agrees with Randy? And then everybody looking at the table. So I decided, okay, all right, I'm not going to stay at Next anymore. This was a stupid idea to come here. This machine's not going to work. And I left. And I said, I want to start another company. I want to start another company. I want to start another company. So I was really impressed with the display PostScript, which is the way they were drawing things on the screen, and the people at Adobe at the time. And it was really cool. So I had a friend working at Adobe. The thing about the Valley then was you had friends working everywhere. It wasn't like it is now where you can't even drive the freeway. It was like pretty empty, and there weren't that many entrepreneurs around. It's different now, obviously. This area is kind of reminiscent of the way the Valley was back then, quite frankly. I like it here in Thousand Oaks, Westlake, because it's not crazy with entrepreneurs that are all competing in one space. It's better than the Valley is now. So I started this company called Emerald City Software. I did it because I liked the Wizard of Oz. And then the people at Seattle were on my case like, you can't call it Emerald City. Seattle's the Emerald City. Anyway, so we had this one convention where John Warnock, who was the CEO of Adobe, someone invented fonts that competed with him, and he had PostScript fonts, and he literally stood up on stage and he cried because he thought it was so sad that someone would compete with him. So I thought, well, I'll support the guy. So I made these buttons. Defend the standard, Adobe PostScript. And so, and I handed them out to everybody at this conference. I think it was a Macworld conference or something. And it turned out that he got one. I didn't know that he had one. I didn't know him that well. But a year later, after we developed several products and we'd taken in $1 million in venture, he bought Emerald City. Adobe bought Emerald City Software, and I went to work at Adobe. And I was the CTO there, or the Director of Engineering. And when we closed the deal, John came out wearing his button. And I was thinking like, man, you know, it's so weird when you do something nice or try to do something to help people when they're down, it always comes back in a good way, in a good way. So I was there. I had 200 people working for me. It was awful. I wasn't innovating. The only fun thing I did was John came to me one day and said, "You've got to figure out a way to stop us killing trees." And I'm like, okay, well, what exactly do you mean? You got to find a replacement for paper. Go figure out, take your best engineers, put them in a room, and figure out a replacement for paper. I'm like, I have no clue what he's talking about. We got everything together, and in about a month, we bless you, we actually did the first version of, let's see, of PDF and Acrobat with 3 people. And so that just kind of convinced me that you really want to do really cool stuff. You can't do it with 300 people easily. Now, it took 300 people to get it out the door, 2 years later. I was gone because, once again, Steve Jobs called me up, and he said, "Randy, you're right, we fixed it. Now come start a software company for Next." This guy. And this is my fail number 2, okay? So I started this company called AppSoft. And our competition called it CrapSoft. And they weren't very nice. But we had a lot of stuff. Steve gave us the, thank you. Steve gave us one of the word processors that we sold. And we produced like 6 or 7 mainline products for Next. And I funded it myself, but shortly thereafter, Mike Moritz from Sequoia, who you may know, he's kind of I don't know, he's like a god in VC land now. He put $2 million into the company. And so we had money to work with him. We had Sequoia capital money, which was pretty important. And then Steve called me up one night and said, "Randy, I've decided to stop making X machines." I'm like, oh man, there goes my market. What am I going to sell this software into? They're not making the machines anymore. And Steve and I kind of had words. And he said some bad words to me, and I said some bad words to him. And our relationship was never the same after that, quite frankly. And so I closed the company down, and I gave Sequoia back whatever money they had. And that leads to lesson number 2. Never create something that's dependent on somebody else or some other company. Like if someone says, "We're inventing something that's really going to revolutionize the XYZ market, and you should help. You should do a product for it with your own money or with other money." And then that never happens. Like I've done this a lot of times, like the pen computing market before it took off. I've done software for it and never went anywhere. And this is the same thing. So now I'm sitting on a ton of inventory. I've got all these boxes. And what I did was I moved everything to my garage. So back to your garage story. It was in my garage. And in fact, Sequoia Capital came down to look at it because I was working on something else. And they thought like, one of the more pompous VCs was, one of them said to him, "So, I had computers everywhere in the garage. Do you have computers like this in your garage?" And he's like, "I have 3 very fine automobiles in my garage. Thank you very much." Okay, great. Well, we're not getting money from Sequoia. So I figured out, how am I going to sell this stuff? Because I didn't have any marketing money. I didn't have any way to sell it. They weren't carrying it in dealers. So there was a thing at the time called Usenet. It was before the internet. And so I got on Usenet in one of the groups, and I said, "I've got all this software for sale," and I started selling it. And I sold $250,000 worth of software on Usenet, just like by posting stuff and doing it. I thought like, damn, you can sell stuff online? That's crazy. And it was just about that time, 2 months later, the internet was allowed, and Al Gore invented the internet. Well, the restrictions on commercial use of the internet were taken off in January of that year. And so I created the Internet Shopping Network. Sorry about the logo. It's kind of bad. I couldn't find, this is old, so I just tried to find them. And we started selling stuff on the internet. We basically put a website out. Actually, Mark Andreessen helped us do it because back in the day he wasn't so important. And and a lot of other people just chipped in, and we had this first e-commerce site on the internet, and it was so cool because I was looking at, we had a screen that every time someone would buy something, it would increment, and then it would start like click, click, and then click, 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 click. And I went down to Ingram Micro, which at the time was a distributor for software and hardware for computers, and I said to them, I want to sell your stuff on the internet, and they said, go away. And then I went back down and found another salesperson. I said, do you guys have a soft copy of your catalog? And they said, yeah. And I said, do you drop ship? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, can I send you an order, and you drop ship it? And they said, yeah. I go, good, send me the soft copy. And I took that, I turned it into a website, and we started selling stuff. And it was crazy. And 3 months later, the home shopping network people at the first internet world came to me, and they, HSN, and they said, we want to buy your company. And I'm like, it's only 3 months. And they said, we're going to go do due diligence. And they sent people out for due diligence, and I hired like 10 temps to sit in the office, to make it look like we had. True story. And so they made us an offer, and we took it, and it was a 3-year payout. And there was a downside to that because along with the Home Shopping Network came the CEO of the Home Shopping Network, which was Barry Diller. And I was Barry Diller's direct report. Now, you think Steve Jobs is bad. Barry Diller's like Steve Jobs on evil steroids. I've actually quoted, I was at a deposition because after I quit the Home Shopping Network as a division president because Barry was driving me crazy. The guy he hired, he got cheated out of stock, and I had to be deposed, and I said some not so nice things about Barry, and he doesn't take my calls anymore. But this leads me to my next lesson, which is simply, I had a bad word in there, and Steve made me change it. It started with A, but never work for mean bosses, right? Life is too short. If you're not happy, it's better to be living in a cardboard, as far as I'm concerned, it's better to be living in a cardboard box on the side of the road than going to work every day and hating what you do. Because life is short. I mean, you die before you know it. And me sooner than you guys, but it's like, it's not something you want to do. So I quit, and I left there, and one of the good things I did was at the time, these guys were in the trailer in the back of Stanford, and they had this list on the internet, right? And they came to me and said, look, we've been offered $1 million for the company. What should we do? You sold a company. And I said, well, don't sell it to the Home Shopping Network. That's for sure. That guy's a jerk. I said, why don't we go talk to Mike Moritz? I just blew through $2 million of his money, and he still talks to me. He's a nice guy. He's like, okay, if you say so. So we went into a little room at Sequoia. It was tiny. It was like, I don't know, it was smaller than the kitchen. And it was David and Jerry and Mike and I. And Mike's like, he just looked at him and said, I'll give you $1 million for 20% of your company. And they're like, geez, $1 million for 20%? And we still get to run it? And he's like, yep, you can run it. And he's like, Randy, you can put $100,000 in at the same rate if you want. And I'm like, no, I don't know if that's going to be, that's $1 billion, $1 billion mistake, but it's okay. And I have here the first business plan of Yahoo, which if you guys want to peruse it out. I was going to pass it around, but Greg told me I'll never get it back. So I'll put it up here if you want to look at it. But my name is in there, so I'm not lying. And so that was a good thing because that really made Mike at Sequoia the person he is because their return was multi-billion dollars in that $1 million investment. And Jerry and David, up until a few years ago, had a good ride too. And I hired Tim Kugel to come in and run it initially, and it was a fun time. It was a fun time. This leads me to my third fail, and this is a big fail. This is a $65 million fail. Yeah. Again, it's Sequoia. They're involved. My friend Mark Kwame, who is a partner at Sequoia, now runs a VC firm in Ohio, came to me and said, we need another search engine. You know, Google needs competition. It's really stupid to try to compete with Google. But anyway, I'm like stupid. So I said, yeah, okay, great. We'll do a search engine. And he said, okay, Sequoia will get behind it. We'll give you $500,000 to get to prototype, another $5 million once you get things up and running. And so I pulled a team together, and we created a search engine called Search Me that basically took pictures of every web page, stored them in a database, and then when you searched, would do the Google search, but it wouldn't use Google. We had to write our own search to compete with Google, which was not easy, and it was expensive. We were burning $2 million a month at the peak because we have 4,000 servers. The search is very, and I stupidly was going around on national TV saying, Google hasn't innovated in years, and Marissa Mayer was like, well, put that guy in their sights. We don't like this guy. And so we raised a total of 65 million over, like, I think 4 rounds. And it was getting to the time, like, it was up in 2007, 2008, which is a really hard time to raise money. I went out to try to raise $35 million. And then there was a call that went from Google back to Sequoia, and they wouldn't do their pro rata on the round, and that basically didn't work out well. But prior to that, we had a buyout offer from Microsoft before Bing was created, $200 million to give us. And the problem was that the last money we took in was at a 250 million post. And that guy would have lost money. And so the board said, no, we're going to turn down that offer of $200 million. And a couple years later, 1 year later, the company shut down. So that was, and I had to lay off 60 employees in one day, which wasn't particularly fun for anybody. So lesson number 4, high valuations are not necessarily a good thing. I know you get diluted if your valuation's low and you take in money, but it blocks exits, it blocks future rounds, and you could say, my company's worth $20 million, I want to raise $5 million right now. And maybe you can't raise it, right, because no one will believe your company's worth $20 million. But if someone does, try getting the next round after that. It'll be a down round, and the first person will be complaining a lot. So, lesson number 4. But what happened was, Mark Kwame had a son who wanted to do stand-up comedy. And he said, Randy, there's no comedy website out there. We need to create one. So between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning, I programmed Funny or Die. And we got Will Ferrell to sign on. And we launched that. It was very much like the same thing with the Internet Shopping Network. We had a clicker, and we took the password off. We didn't advertise it. It wasn't on YouTube. It was a destination site, funnyordie.com. We had that one video you might have seen with the little girl who's the landlord, right, with Will Ferrell. And I looked at it before we published it, and I'm like, my wife and I are looking at it, I'm like, I don't know. This is either going to be really bad or really good. And we were down in LA. We lived in the valley at the time. We took the password off. Driving back, we get as far as the Grapevine, and I get a call from the server guy saying, what is happening? We've got 20,000 simultaneous video views right now. And we didn't advertise it, nothing. And we were doing 3 million video views a day 2 days later. And it's like, wow, the internet's really efficient. If you have something that's value. But a lot of it is luck. And that's kind of gets me to my last confession, which is successful startups. I mean, you can have a team, you can have the idea, you can have product market fit. If you don't have any of those, then you have problems. But even if you have all those things, timing's got to be right. You got to be lucky. And if it doesn't happen, maybe it'll happen the next time. But I don't think trying and failing once is the end of the road for most entrepreneurs. And you just got to kind of ride it out. So right now, I want to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing here at the Hub. I'm working with a company called Driav. We're doing insurance for autonomous vehicles. So that means like self-driving cars. And so the big thing with self-driving cars is if it gets in an accident, whose fault is it if it's driving itself? Like the Tesla accident, terrible Tesla accident that happened in the Bay Area a couple weeks ago. And so we're muddling through that solution, and we're also trying to actually figure out how you measure risk when someone's driving an autonomous car, or whether you're driving it yourself. And it's really a factor of what autonomous features, we call them ADAS features, are engaged in driver behavior, whether they're distracted in the route and the time of day. So that's kind of where we're concentrating our time right now. I'm here almost every day, Steve, well, sometimes every day. If you have any questions, I'm glad to take them now. If you want to contact me by email, there's my email address. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Steve.